especially in textbooks, magazines like this one. Discover magazine, was your ancestor a sea sponge? They say this is your ancestor. Now, that may be your ancestor, it's not mine. But the bottom line is, over and over, what we are being fed is this idea that man evolved. In fact, this textbook says from bacteria that lived more than 4 billion years ago. Or that we evolved from some ape-like creature. Or how about this one, put out by Arms and Camp? They say, by the 7th month, the fetus looks from the outside like a tiny normal baby. But it's not. Let me ask you, why would we be teaching our young people that a 7-month-old in the womb is not a human child? Now, as you think about that, consider for just a moment what I call the evil of marketing. Take a look at the picture that's associated with that statement. Any lady in this room that's ever given birth will tell you, that's not a 7-month-old in the womb, is it? Because by 7 months, they're doing aerobics in the womb. And yet, think about what this really does to the value of human life. Over and over, what we see are statements that are basically trying to tell folks that, hey, there is no God, you're just here by chance. And sadly, lots and lots of folks have bought into it. Take a look at this quote. This was at the American Association for the Advancement of Science conference several years ago. They had George Cohn do a presentation, and during that he said this: the intelligent design movement belittles God. It makes God a designer, an engineer. The God of religious faith is a God of love. He did not design me. If I were to ask you today, is there design in the human body or design in the universe? What do you think? Yes. Absolutely. And if you see design, by definition, there has to be a designer. We could spend quite literally the entire time today just talking about a small aspect of hearing. What it takes to make sound come into your body, be actually converted into a physical signal, then electric and chemical signal, interpreted by your brain, understood by your brain, and then acted on. Or we could spend a long time. Rick was talking about the eye for just a moment. Loads and loads of complexity. Most every single camera, all video equipment is designed after this right here. What's interesting is they model things after the eye and then turn right around and say, but we're not designed. All the way from biggest all the way down to the cellular level, what we see is loads and loads of design, architecture, so to speak. I want to spend just a minute kind of proving the fact that, yeah, there is a God. We definitely were created. And then we're going to dive a little bit later specifically into the brain. I am going to give you, I didn't give them a break last night. I will give you guys a short break today, especially since there's food here. But if we were going to define the evidence for God, how do we do that? The easiest way, just get outside. You start seeing complexity. You start seeing things like all the different types of plants, and you're thinking, okay, how does that plant take water and nutrients 3, 4, 5 stories up when you think about putting a water fountain in a 5-story building just by chance? Getting the water supply up, getting the plumbing down. But if we were to take a hike, we don't just see plants, we see animals, things like squirrels, deer. But let's say we see this guy right here. You guys look at it, you say, oh, that's a cute little frog. I look at it as a wonderful learning opportunity. So here's what I do. I grab that frog I bring him back into this setting and I put him in a blender. And I invite one of you guys to come up and press the on button. What would we get?
Me crying.
We would get frog juice, right? Now, follow me for just a minute. In that solution, can I honestly say I have everything it takes to make a frog?
Sure.
All the DNA, all the proteins necessary, right? So let's say I put that into a container, I throw that to you. How long would you have to shake that up to make a frog? Or how much electricity would you have to zap it with to make a frog? Folks, everybody in this room is thinking the same thing right now, and that is, you're never going to get a frog. All you're ever going to have is frog juice, right? Now, follow me for just a moment. I'm actually giving you a head start. I'm giving you all of the components in the same location that you need. So how in the world am I supposed to believe that life came jumping up out of some primordial soup if you can't get a frog with me giving you everything already there? How in the world are you going to get life out of that right there? Now, let's take it one step a little bit deeper. On the screen, you're seeing one of the latest pictures of a portion of a cell. That's not the whole cell. That's actually just part of the outer wall. You'll notice things like a mitochondria, part of the Golgi apparatus, cell wall. In fact, let me blow up the cell wall for you right here. That's just the cell wall. If you can't get a frog by shaking it up like this, how in the world are you going to get this kind of complexity by random chance? The answer? You don't. And so even though they would say, oh yeah, you know, life just evolved up out of some primordial soup, the true evidence says no, there had to be a creator. By the way, you know what the latest thing they're saying in textbooks? Because they realize how ridiculous this is. Now they're saying, well, you know, life may have been seeded here by aliens from other planets. Let's stop and think about that for just a minute. First off, you're not actually explaining where life came from. You're just moving it to a different location. Okay? Second problem. You say you don't believe in God because you can't see him, and yet you believe in aliens? Does that make sense to anybody? Now, let me give it to you in another way. I want to basically kind of transport everybody here to my house on a Sunday morning. Okay? Sunday mornings at our house are a little bit chaotic. My wife and I, we have a running joke that the singer Lionel Richie, that he is not a Christian. And the reason we say that is because Lionel Richie sings a song where he says, it's easy like Sunday morning. We have 4 children. There is nothing easy about Sunday morning. Okay? When they were little, for whatever reason, we had belt monsters, shoe monsters, Bible that would hide their stuff. Okay? And so right about the time it's time to get in the car, we would hear, but I don't have my shoes. Or I can't find my belt. I know that never happened to any of y'all. Our house on Sunday morning is crazy. Now that they're grown, 2 of my older sons preaching, I'm usually out preaching. There are times we're going in all different directions. So Sunday morning at our home is what we call do-it-yourself breakfast. Okay, we've got granola bars, cereal bars lined up. So imagine coming to my house on a Sunday morning. You sit down at the table, you realize the cereal has been knocked over, and you look on the table, and there's actually a message in the cereal. Now, if I were to ask you guys, did that happen by chance? Just 5 words, right? Take out the garbage, Mom. If you really want to know who the intelligent designer behind that one, that's Mom, right? How long do you think you would have to dump out that cereal box in order to get those exact letters like that? You realize you could dump cereal the rest of your life, literally. Every second of your life, and you would never get that exact combination. Why? Because everybody in here recognizes the chances of it totally too statistically impossible. And yet that's just 5 words. Here's the amazing part. Inside every cell of your body, you have a much, much longer code. And yet they want you to think that DNA just happened by chance. Folks, if you can't get 5 words, take out the garbage mom by random chance, how in the world would you get a strand of DNA that codes for everything about you? You see, we know today that the DNA for a human being, the amount of volume it is, took us 11 years, by the way. 11 years to actually come up with the human genome. Multiple labs, millions of dollars. In fact, the evidence is so overwhelming. A guy by the name of Anthony Flew used to be an atheist. For 80 years, this guy was an atheist. He actually debated one of our Christian brothers named Tom Warren. At the end of his life, he realized, you know what? DNA is too compelling. There has to be a God. He said this: "It now seems to me that findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design." Now, let's go back to that cereal for just a minute. So, you agree that getting those 5 words is really ridiculously impossible. But let's compare those 5 words to the DNA of a single cell amoeba. Okay, the simplest creature around. How long is the DNA for a single cell amoeba? A single cell amoeba, the DNA would fill up 1,000 volumes of an encyclopedia. 1,000 volumes of an encyclopedia. If you can't get 5 words by chance, how are you going to get this? Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of the DNA model, he made a very revealing quote. He said, "Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved." In other words, we got to keep telling ourselves, hey, this is a product of evolution, because when we really look at it, we see design. Rick mentioned us doing some neural recordings. When I was in medical school, one of the things that we were doing, we were dropping probes into the brain. We were doing single cell recordings. And so here's what that means. That means we were making these probes that were much, much smaller than a hair, dropping them into the brain while the patient was still awake. We would hit it with a little bit of electricity, and we would see what would move, or if they would speak or do different things. It's kind of fun. On one particular occasion, we had a patient that had gone to sleep. All the nurses were away for whatever reason. They were off counting needles, doing their thing. We're looking at a stereoscope. So I'm on one side, he's on the other. I raised up and I said, "Hey, do you think there's any way that this happened by chance?" There's a neurosurgeon across from me. He's actually from Japan. He raised up and he said, "There is no way." And he began to talk about things like how neurons have voltage-gated channels and ion-gated channels and all the complexity that we were seeing. And about that time, a nurse walked within our peripheral vision and he totally clammed up. Wouldn't say another word. Because right now, in the scientific community, it is very much politically incorrect to believe in a God. In fact, there are folks who've lost their jobs who don't support the evolutionary theory. Psalm chapter 139, verse 14 says this, I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. I'm here to tell you, you were created. National Geographic, Time Magazine, they would love for you to believe that you're just the product of some ape-like creature. In fact, we usually see these about every 9 to 15 months. You know, there's a brand new alleged missing link. But what's the truth about it? Like, for instance, this guy right here, Nebraska Man. This is my favorite. Nebraska Man was actually presented as evidence during the Scopes monkey trial that some of you remember studying in school. So, presented as evidence. In fact, this picture was shown in the Illustrated London News in 1922. One of the things that I'm teaching young people to do anytime they see images like this is to ask a simple question. Where's your evidence? Like, okay, so you say we came from an ape. What have you actually got? Because when you actually look at the scientific study, all they got is one tooth. That looks like 4 on the screen. It's actually the same tooth taken from 4 different vantage points. From that one tooth, they get this guy and his wife. Now think about this for just a minute. They use that as proof for evolution in a court case. They put a picture of it in the Illustrated London News, only to 20 years later find out that one tooth actually came from an extinct pig. That's your real missing link right there. Or how about this one? Anybody ever heard of Neanderthal man? Now, I realize there are some ladies in this room, you think your husbands are Neanderthals. Just because he's messy does not mean evolution's true, right? How many of you in this room remember getting National Geographic and Life magazine when you were young? Talked to a gentleman who was an elder in the church. He was in his 70s. Had completely walked away from the church. I called him. We had a long discussion. Finally, it came up. He said, you know, Brad, surely all of those magazines can't be wrong. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I remember when I was young, my parents subscribed to 2 magazines, Life and National Geographic. And he goes on to tell me how every single month, what he would do is he would go down into their basement, he would grab those magazines, he would look at images kind of like this one, and he said that's when really the seeds got planted. If you don't think that magazines, textbooks actually will plant seeds in the heart and mind of your children, please wake up. Amen. This guy right here is quite literally the cover story guy for National Geographic. They love him. Absolutely love him. In the foreground, you see what they would call a Neanderthal skull. In the background, you see a human skull. Basically, the only difference besides the color, which one of them's been in the dirt, one of them's been bleached. But besides that, the main difference is right up here. You got a really thick brow ridge. And so here's what they would say. Because we are so similar, this guy is our closest of kin. So, according to their story, you've got primates that walked on all 4s. Finally, we decided to walk uprightly, and they would put him right over here next to Homo sapiens. Here's the problem with that. All the way back in 1958, a guy by the name of Dr. A.J. Cave actually examined the original Neander Valley fossils. and he proved that it was nothing more than a person who had suffered from advanced stages of arthritis. Now here's a question I want you to think about. Does arthritis change bone structure? Anybody in this room ever had arthritis? I'm looking at a bunch of people. Rheumatoid arthritis? Rickets, osteoporosis, any of those things sound familiar? Does that actually change bone structure, bone density? Absolutely. So follow me for just a minute. In my lifetime, I've probably dissected well over 500 to 600 human cadavers. Okay? I've seen everything from small infants all the way up to 100-year-olds. Big heads, fat heads, little heads, normal heads, everything. All kinds of variation. In fact, as I'm looking at you in this room, I'm seeing variation. I'm seeing some people that have skinny heads, some people have fat heads. In fact, in this room, there's at least one or two of you that would qualify as a Neanderthal. I'm not going to point you out right now. We'll wait until later. But here's what I want you to think about. Just because somebody has a disease or has a difference does not make them a missing link. Jack Kuzo wrote a book called Buried Alive. He actually studied the Neanderthal fossils more than I did. In his particular book, he said this: you must understand the skull really cries out disease. The teeth are badly decayed. The bones of the vault of the skull are extremely thick. There are many features that testify of acromegaly or the excessive secretion of growth hormone in adulthood. What are you saying, Jack? Are you saying that that's a missing link or a sick human? See, there is a difference, right? What does the fossil record really show? I'm going to let Jeremy Rifkin tell you, because I think he summed it up beautifully. He said this: what the record shows is nearly a century of fudging and finagling by scientists attempting to force various fossil morsels and fragments to conform with Darwin's notion, all to no avail. He said, today, the millions of fossils stand as very visible, ever-present reminders of the paltriness of the arguments and the overall shabbiness of the theory that marches under the banner of evolution. He's absolutely true. And here's what's funny. We actually call ourselves Homo sapiens, which means wise ones, and then we claim to have come from monkeys. Professing to be wise, they became fools. So let's zoom in a little bit closer on the brain. If I were to ask you, which one came first? Nerves or organs? If evolution is true, and everything is kind of a step-by-step process, you evolve this, and then years later you evolve that, which came first, nerves or organs? Most of you right now are thinking, well, you got to have organs. Got to have a heart, got to have lungs, got to have everything. But do you realize that without that nervous innervation, your heart is useless? You have a nerve in your body called the vagus nerve. Basically controls this right here, the pump. You cut the vagus nerve or you turn it off, all of a sudden your pump doesn't work anymore. It is quite literally, at that point, useless. So, obviously, you got to have nerves. All right, so now we've got to picture a human body with a bunch of nerves dangling down, waiting for you to evolve a heart and lungs. And now that doesn't really work for me either, does it? By the way, where'd the first nerve cell come from? Because nerve cells are different from all the other nerves in the body or all the other cells in the body. You think about what is a muscle cell meant to do? Well, it's actually meant to contract. This is meant to conduct a signal. Also, consider that it takes a cell to make a cell. which really begs the question, okay, where did that original nerve cell come from? In other words, how do you get a living brain full of all kinds of different neuronal cells that are feeding on oxygen, that have to have the right nutrients? How do you get that if really we just came from a cosmic explosion, Big Bang? You can. If you can actually listen to all of this material and not see design, then let me just point out to you, you're doing a whole lot better than most people, because the brain screams design. Complexity. It is the most complex matter in the universe, bar none. A couple of things, basics. So the brain is not just a single organ like we oftentimes think about it. There's lots of different parts going on in there. You guys have heard things like the brain stem, the cerebellum, the cerebrum, all these different parts. Each part actually plays a major role. Some of them act like storage containers. Others are more like New York's Central Station. And they actually send that nerve signal to the right place. They channel it into the right pathway. For those of you who got a weak stomach, you may want to just kind of blink or look down for a second. To me, I can eat a Snickers bar and it doesn't bother me. That is a true human brain. A lot softer than what you might think. In fact, it is almost the consistency of almost like pudding when it is living. Which, by the way, if it's a really soft consistency, if it's not hard, full of formaldehyde or a preservative, think about what happens if you were to take that and it's inside the skull and you hit something like a windshield really hard. You know what happens to that? It starts to swell just like a bruise would. And you know what happens at that point? The pressure doesn't have anywhere to go except down. And so it starts putting pressure on all of, we call them cranial nerves, and your spinal cord, and you pass out, you go into a coma, and you may actually end up in a vegetative state, depending on how much of that swelling goes back down. This is what it looks like from the outside. This is what it looks like when you cut it right down the middle. So lots of stuff going on. The way I want everybody in this room to think of it is, if you were to take a telephone network across Marshfield, really complex telephone network, going to every single house, right? What happens if a tornado comes through here? What happens to all those telephone lines? They go down. Certain parts of the city is not going to have any telephone service. Certain parts will. Certain parts are going to be kind of spotty. That's what actually happens oftentimes in the brain with either disease, aging, or damage. It's basically you have a problem with the telephone network. So let's talk for just a minute about how it works. You've got neurons in the brain that are actually communicating with each other. They're going to send a signal to the one beside them. So instead of us thinking of it as like a copper line, electrical line that we've got in the walls here, these are actually made up of little independent units that each one have to signal the next one. And it does it a whole lot faster than most of the stuff you're used to. And oh, by the way, it's actually made up of living tissue. So I want us to talk about 4 different areas. I'm not going to get super deep, but there are some things I'm going to have to say. And by the way, this one's informal, so if you guys have questions, comments, jump in there. 4 areas. We're going to talk about regions of the brain. So, for instance, 40 years ago, if you weren't doing real good mentally, they did something called a frontal lobotomy. You know what that is? That means they literally cut out the front portion of your brain. They used to think, hey, that's how we'll fix stuff. We have since learned that that's not really a good approach. We know, for instance, the temporal region has a lot to do with things like fine motor skills, communication. There's also circuits or tracks in the brain. So as you're studying this beautiful organ, you're also learning that inside that organ, there's tracks that maybe are responsible for motor skills or for speech. Optical tract obviously is for vision. Auditory tract is for hearing. Neurons are what make up those tracks. So not only do you have highways or pathways, those pathways are made up of individual cells. Now, let's go one step even deeper than that. Those individual cells, those individual nerve cells, at the ends of them, they have what's called a synapse. And that's really where all the business happens from each and every one of these things. So, very, very highly interconnected. I'm going to show you a couple of actual pictures, but what I want you to think about is all this is going on without any input from you. So, on the left side of the screen, you see basically what's going on at a synapse. You've got a nerve that is releasing neurotransmitters, and it is exciting the nerve beside it, causing it to conduct a signal. Let me throw out something that some of you in this room are familiar with. Anybody ever heard of Parkinson's disease? Very, very common. Part of the problem with Parkinson's disease is the patient is not producing enough dopamine. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. And so what happens is instead of a normal release of dopamine, that patient doesn't have enough. And so that signal stops. It doesn't get sent on down the line. We've come in and we've said, these folks don't have enough dopamine, so what we're going to do is we're going to prescribe either a synthetic or an artificial dopamine like L-Dopa, levodopa, and basically we're going to give them what they need so that they'll have it in sufficient quantities. This is a very, very textbook-looking nerve cell. You've got the nucleus on one end, you've got the axon on the other. So this is kind of the way they present it in a textbook. That's what it really looks like. That is microscopic. You can't see it with the human eye. Which means all those little bitty fibers, the branches that are coming off, are a lot smaller than you think they are. Also, if you look really carefully, you'll notice at the end of most of those fibers, there's little bumps. And those bumps actually play a role in things like memory and how well the brain functions. This is a neuronal net. It's actually a real neuronal net in the brain where you can see how interconnected everything is. One of the things that you need to know as far as brain health is cells that wire together or fire together, wire together. And that's important. Because think about it for just a moment. If you use it, you're less likely to what? Lose it. And so we're going to study a little bit about that. By the way, this is also a big deal with addiction. A lot of the problems with addiction is they've actually rewired their brain to the point where the only way they can receive pleasure is by doing certain stimulus. And so in order to break that addiction, you actually have to rewire it back to what it needs to be. All right, aging. Anybody in here aging? Some of the problems that we've got during aging. is things like we don't produce as many neurotransmitters. I just mentioned dopamine, for instance. So people with Parkinson's patients, that is a very easy way to diagnose. If they are not producing enough dopamine, they've got tremors, that's the first place a doctor's going to look. Also, sometimes the phone lines, they get tangled up. Or they disappear. So in the case, for instance, of Alzheimer's, a lot of times what's going on there is you got phone lines that were perfect and in place for many, many decades, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, there's a new neighborhood and those lines are gone. And so now you're wanting to recall a memory, but there's no line to send that down to recall that memory, and you just can't not do it. Also, the other thing that happens is just flat out trauma or damage. So, for instance, somebody that damages the frontal cortex, we know what the frontal cortex does. That patient probably going to have a impaired ability for decision making, have defective social and moral reasoning. So we know if there's certain injuries in certain portions of the brain, we kind of know what to look for. We kind of know how that's going to act out. On the screen, lots and lots of physical illnesses, ailments that are happening as you age. A whole lot of this stuff is either controlled by the brain or affected by the brain. So let me give you an example. If you have diabetes, you might think, well, that has nothing to do with brain health because that's more, sugar, insulin, that kind of thing. But here's the problem with diabetes. Diabetes is actually a circulation issue. A lot of times you're not getting good circulation in your extremities, but it also means you're not getting as good a circulation up here as well. And so diabetes, even though, yes, it does affect your extremities, it can also affect your brain and the way things are transmitted. So a lot of this stuff is kind of interconnected. Here's a major point that I want to make sure everybody here understands. This wasn't God's original plan. Sometimes we get frustrated as we get older. It's like, man, why can't I? And you can fill in the blank. Do you realize the aging process and dying was not a part of his original plan? Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 20, says this: For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into freedom and the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. Everybody in this room, you have a earthly, fleshly body that is decaying. There is not a cream, liquid, pill, or surgery that's going to stop that. You may slow it down a little bit, but you're not going to stop it. And it all goes back to God's original plan. God's original plan was that we would have access to the tree of life. And then we'd live forever. You realize if Adam and Eve had not messed up, guess what? They'd still be here today. They would still be basking in the glory of God, having access to the tree of life. Now, in a really twisted way, I'm glad they did mess up, because I'd hate to come 6,000 years in the future and I'm born and I screwed up for everybody. Okay, wouldn't want that. But God's original plan was there's going to be this paradise environment. When they sinned, it quite literally ruined that original plan. So sin introduced, all of a sudden God realizes, you know what? I can't be in a fallen planet and be a holy God. I can't walk with them anymore because this is a fallen planet. We are living in the result of that. And so when you hear things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cancers, please understand that wasn't God's original plan. In fact, he created Adam and Eve very good, according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. It's only time and genetic mutations that have brought all that mess in to this fallen world. Part of the glory of heaven is that we're not going to have to worry about that. Sometimes I think what we try too hard to do is we try to make earth into heaven when it was never really intended to be that way in this fallen situation. Let's talk about this one. We'll get into it, and then I'll give you guys a short break. How many of you have heard of dementia? How many of you forgot you heard of dementia? No, I'm just kidding. Dementia is a disease process. There are stages. So when somebody says, my mom has dementia, which, you guys putting this out on Facebook?
Not yet.
Okay. I just have to make sure she doesn't see this. So my mom does have dementia. About a year and a half ago, we moved her we built an add-on to our house. She has an apartment right literally connected to our house. We're now kind of her full-time caregivers because we started noticing that there were some times where she was slipping. She would get in the car, get out, and not know where she is anymore. One particular occasion, she came home and she said, "Brad, you need to listen to my car." And I went outside, and quite literally on the passenger's front side, there was no tire. It was just rim. At which point the keys got taken away. But we realized, okay, mom is not fully there. Now, I said dementia is a process, meaning you may have dementia at a either much worse or a much less degree than she does. And in most people, it is progressive, meaning it's going to continue and get worse. You've got memory loss. You got over 170 irreversible types of dementia. So this is a big umbrella that a lot of things fit under. So somebody that has Alzheimer's is likely showing dementia first. Somebody that has Parkinson's may likely show dementia first. Lots and lots of different types of things that will result in dementia. There are a few that are reversible, but the vast majority are going to be a progressive. 3 different states that are totally different that I want to make sure you hear me kind of separate. There are people that are delirious or in delirium. This is a very acute onset, very rapid. So if you wake up one day and all of a sudden, man, you can't remember anything, you're acting a little bit differently, there's a good chance that's not dementia. That's more of something like a delirium caused by either trauma, drugs, something like that, an altered state of consciousness. There's also depression. Depression is different from dementia. Depression has a gradual onset just like dementia does, but it can normally be treated. So think about this for just a minute. I mentioned the brain is like a bunch of telephone lines. I want you to keep that in mind, but I also want you to think of it as a chemical soup, like your favorite vegetable soup, right? What happens if you get too much of one particular ingredient? Not as good. Like if you get too much salt, not good. If your vegetable soup only has green beans in it, and there's no carrots, corn, potatoes, that's not really good soup, right? In depression and things like bipolar disorder, oftentimes what's happening is your chemical soup gets out of balance. And so what the doctor will try to do is basically add the component that you are missing or reduce a component that you got too much of. And that's depression. It can be treated oftentimes with medication. Dementia, totally different. It is a gradual onset, just like depression, but you're going to have memory loss, and you're also eventually going to start having cognitive function loss. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form. In fact, I dare say in this room, probably most of you either know somebody that's had it, maybe it's in your family line. Nearly 70% of all dementia patients are Alzheimer's patients. 4.5 million Americans have it. It's actually much higher than that at this point because we've got a lot of baby boomers that are what? Getting older. And as we age, this gets to be an even bigger number. Estimated that 60% of all nursing home residents have Alzheimer's disease. Notice what I underlined at the bottom. Alzheimer's is not normal aging. Normal aging meaning when somebody hits 90 and they can't find their keys, that's not a big deal. That doesn't mean they immediately have Alzheimer's. I'm not 90, and there's times where I'm looking at my wife going, I can't find my keys again. I promise you I don't have Alzheimer's, okay? But there are occasions where I just have of course, part of it is I have 4 children and I'm trying to keep up with them. But that's not a normal process. Alzheimer's is not a normal process. It is a progressive, basically decaying of the brain. I'm going to show you a picture and then we'll take a break. So if you look on the left-hand side, that is the brain. It is a brain slice through a normal person who is aged normally. On the right-hand side, it's the same exact layer of the brain. But do you notice any differences? What's the major difference?
Shrinkage.
There's a whole lot less, I'm going to use the word meat. There's a lot less meat there, right? A lot less brain tissue. And that's exactly what's going on with Alzheimer's. By the way, you can do all kinds of different studies. I said I was going to give you a break. I'm going to give you a break. But you can do brain scans. You can do blood tests, all kinds of things. But you know the only way to 100% diagnose and confirm Alzheimer's? It's at an autopsy where you're looking for this right here. That's the only way that somebody can say with 100% accuracy, yep, that person has Alzheimer's. All the rest of the time, it's basically, yeah, they've got Alzheimer's like issues, they've got things that are pointing in that direction, but that's the only way we can know for sure. All right, we're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit about brain health. How do we help things? Yeah.
Has Alzheimer's had any research in the DNA mutations?
Has it had research with DNA mutations? You mean like causative agents? Like what would cause it, or?
Exactly. I mean, if you have mutations that shows a mutated breast cancer, mutated thyroid cancer, do they have yet, or are they doing research that shows mutation DNA for Alzheimer's?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is there does look like there could be a genetic component that is passed on. So she's going to prevent y'all from going to break. That's okay. We need to talk about this. So lots of what is going on with brain injuries today and brain diseases is actually caused by mutations and environmental issues. We've introduced things to the human body that we should not have. Many of them many years ago, some of them currently. Because of that introduction, we've had mutations that are now, we think, being passed on to future generations. I'll give you a couple of examples. Lead paint, not real good. Some of you guys in this room, you painted your homes with lead paint. You probably painted your cribs were painted with lead paint and you teethed on them. And I can tell by looking at you.
Yeah.
But here's the point. We can't say with any certainty, lead paint causes Alzheimer's. But we do see an uptick in people who were living during that time with that particular issue. And we also now are seeing, we've had it long enough to say, oh, and it looks like it's now in that particular family, so there may be a genetic component that's being passed on. As for a specific DNA marker, it's not there yet. I'm not sure it's gonna be, because it is a really peculiar disease. Very, very peculiar. I saw another hand. I'll tell you what we'll do. If this is okay with you guys, I am gonna let you guys get up, stretch, use the restroom. We'll come back and we'll go get into some of these questions, and we'll talk about how do we have good brain health.
Well, get your little circle there.
So, in talking about Alzheimer's patients, you've got different stages. Some of you here probably have recognized somebody in the early stages where they need reminders, their daily routine becomes difficult, concentration is difficult. In the middle stage of Alzheimer's, you're going to see changes in personality, maybe paranoia, maybe a lot more emotional roller coaster kind of things, and may get lost easily, need a lot more hand-on care, and then late in the disease, may not recognize you. And those of you who have experienced that is really tough. But let me encourage you, keep honor, keep respecting your parents, your elderly. 2 reasons. 1, because that's what the Bible says to do. And 2, because somewhere in there, they still exist. Yes, sir?
I saw a thing, kind of the same thing, and it says just to try to remember that they're not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. 3 different areas that are affected. So, unlike if you have a heart issue, it affects your heart, your circulation, right? This can affect your cognition, your behavior, and your emotions. So, it actually can play a range over a multitude of areas in your life or the patient's life. Obviously, memory, learning, language, abstract thinking, those kinds of things. Behavior, so the person may want to say something but not know how to form what they want to say. And so you'll see them basically kind of pause and get frozen, so to speak. Personal care deteriorates, lapses in clarity, possible hallucinations. And then as far as their emotions, very, very much disorganized. They may cry at an inappropriate time, or they may laugh at a very inappropriate time. I've seen people with Alzheimer's at funerals laughing when it's not really appropriate time for them to laugh. There are medications, primarily right now things like Harrub that are patches or pills, trying to help you, but let me make sure you understand these are more Band-Aids, because the brain is going to continue to do what you saw in that slide. And so while this is going to maybe help a little bit short term, long term wise, it is not going to fix the problem. How do we protect brain health? What are some things we can do? We're going to talk about 5 different areas. Eating healthy, which I thought I'd do right before you guys go over there. Regular exercise, keeping your brain active, social connections, and believe it or not, sleep is extremely important. One of the things that evolutionists can't explain is sleep. Think about this for just a moment. If evolution is all about survival of the fittest, why in the world would we evolve a lifestyle where for 8 hours a day you are laying down, helpless, asleep, where the enemy could hurt you, get you, take you out, etc.? Wouldn't it be smarter, if this is survival of the fittest, to evolve some way where, 30 minutes rest, all I need, and I'm good to go? But if you try to live on 30 minutes of rest for too long, guess what? You will die. So, a couple of things. Healthy eating. If you want to prolong healthy brain health, folks, it's like the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. If you are eating too much of certain types of food, it's going to affect this right here. Now, I'm going to throw you a curveball. For the longest time, everybody kept saying, oh, we got to take fats out of the diet. Take out fats, take out fats. Guess what? Your brain needs some fat. Because the axons are actually insulated by a fatty lipid layer, which means if you don't have that, that signal doesn't get conducted as well. And so good fats, things like avocados and other good fats, those you need in order to have healthy brains. Obviously, eat or drink less sugar. I am convinced that sugar is probably one of the worst things for us. It is, as me and my mother-in-law say, it's our drug of choice. Okay? Usually about 2 or 3 times a year, I will take myself completely off of sugar. I do that sometimes because when I travel, it's very easy to add 15, 20 pounds. And so I will cut sugar. And do you know, within 3 days of cutting it, a couple of things happen. Number one, my body, just like an addict, is telling me, you really, really need sugar. But I also start to feel better. And if I can get to about day 5 or day 7, guess what? I have less pains, less aches. Overall health begins to do this. And so if you do consume a whole lot of sugar, let me encourage you to maybe trim back on that as much as you can. Fruits, vegetables, obviously going to be a major part of your diet. You still need protein. Got to have it.
Yep.
So make sure you're choosing good proteins. Lean meats, fish, that kind of thing. Choose low or non-dairy dairy. Big thing, portion sizes. If you go out to eat, the portions they give us are for 2 people in most restaurants. Okay? And what we do is we look at that, we're like, oh man. And we start eating and eating and eating, and before you know it, you've eaten most of what 2 people should have eaten. So my wife and I, sometimes what we'll do is we'll actually go ahead and cut it in half before we ever start eating. Move half of it over and either take it home or we'll share a plate together. The other thing is make sure you hydrate. You would be surprised at how many times people get dehydrated, and that is a cascading effect. It throws everything off. I'm gonna move around. I do better when I move around. So last week I did a really, really, really intense look at what happened in the last 10 minutes of Jesus' life, medically speaking. And it was pretty intense. It's hard to do that because you're kind of mentally going through what he went through. You're not obviously physically, but as you're relaying all the things. So one of the things that Jesus would definitely have had was hypovolemic shock. Not enough fluid. When you don't have enough fluid, that means you're not getting as good a blood circulation, which then means you're not getting good enough oxygen to all the parts of your body. It also throws off things like your potassium levels. Why is that a big deal? Your potassium helps with your heart conduction, with how your heart is beating. If you got too much potassium, because you're not able to dilute it out with adequate water, you can go into what's called AFib or VFib, where your heart, instead of beating, it actually starts quivering. And so lots and lots of things are affected by how much fluid you got. The next one, most of you in this room don't like. That doesn't change the fact that we still do need to get adequate exercise. If you want a healthy brain, that means you need to actually move your legs, move your arms, get some aerobic exercise. Because what you're doing is you're feeding your brain oxygen at a higher concentration at that point. Reduces the risk of diabetes, heart disease, depression, and stroke. If you are somebody who is right now leaning into a bad health situation, I want you to try this. 2 weeks. Cut sugar, get outside and walk every single day for 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks. and see what happens. You will probably be blown away at how much better you feel. And oh, by the way, you may get to start reducing some of the pills that you're taking on an average daily basis. I'm not a pill person, okay? Medicine changed a lot while I was in medical school. We went from actually practicing medicine and treating patients like human beings to doing two things: being very pharmaceutical driven and very insurance driven. I don't like that, because what you're doing at that point is you're checking off boxes of what will this person's insurance cover and what do I need to do in order to cover my rear end. Okay, that's the insurance side. And then the other side is, okay, what pill can I give them in order to try to put a Band-Aid on this? Well, sometimes a better approach is not just to hand them a pill, but to look at their lifestyle and say, okay, you sit in front of a computer 8 hours a day, that's a problem, because we may need to get you up and out. And you know what? Instead of you paying $30 a month for these pills, I'm going to encourage you $15 a month for a gym membership and go every day, just for 30 minutes. Two totally different approaches. Other things. Make sure that you are preventing falls, especially as you age, because everybody in this room knows you could be doing great. You have a fall, and now we've got a cascade of problems. Because your inactivity from that fall, maybe you broke a hip, broke a leg, is going to add and compound other problems. Also may improve the connections among brain cells. So as you get out and are doing things, what you're doing is you're actually basically feeding the wiring in a good way. Remember I said cells that fire together, wire together? You want cells that are actively growing and actively wiring in the right way, and part of the way we can do that is getting out and exercising. I had the chance to talk to, where'd he go? Leon. Right here, right in front of me, during the break, and I hope you mind if I share. So he is right now in the early stages of Parkinson's disease. And he was sharing some of the things that he is doing, and I was applauding him because he is staying very mentally active. He is doing things to try to keep things going, but he said this, he said, I'm finding new things hard. And that's true, because here's what happens with things like Parkinson's disease. Short-term memory goes away. But you know what stays? Long-term. And so I was encouraging him, things that you have muscle memory for, things that you've been doing a long time, keep doing it. Because you don't want that muscle memory to go away. He was talking about they're even trying to do things like take Spanish courses. Anything that you can do to exercise the brain is going to be a good thing. And we're going to talk a little bit about that right here, keeping your brain active. If you're not reading books, magazines on a regular basis, do so. Games, puzzles. Most of you in here probably have iPhones, iPads. There are loads of free games. Wordscapes, all kinds of different word type things, Sudoku type games that cause your brain to have to think. And that's a great thing. Because it's basically, you see these big, strong guys at the gym and they're bench pressing. That's what you're doing with your brain. You're bench pressing with your brain in a good way. Take classes, join a club. All of these things are things that will help you to prolong the overall health. Along with that, so yes, you need to be doing those kind of things, but you also need to have social connections. Why would I say that? Is there a difference in getting an email or a letter from a grandchild versus having them come and run into your arms and tell you something personally? Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. There's a whole lot of difference. Because in one, you're reading a two-dimensional screen and you don't get their voice, you don't get to touch, the sensory part. It's more of just a educational, yeah, I'm going to read this email. But when they come into the room and your eyes see them and your ears hear them and your skin feels them, all of a sudden you're using multiple sensory inputs, and it's actually much, much better for you. Yes?
How do you get past anxiety when you have anxiety from PTSD?
Okay, so if somebody's got anxiety, whether that be, let me ask this, do you know what is causing it?
Yes.
Can you share what is causing it?
She had an incident with a ex
Yeah,
friend,
yeah,
and to put it this way, he wasn't real nice,
right, okay,
and I was used the word brutal,
yeah.
like the best way to put it.
So in most anxiety disorders, there are trigger events, or there are triggers that will cause somebody to feel that. If you can identify the triggers, then you're on your way to helping to slow or stop those completely. For some people, it may be sights, sounds, it may be, I don't know your exact situation, so I'm going to use some hypotheticals if you don't mind. Yeah, go ahead.
For instance, Christmas time,
Yeah,
do not take her into Walmart at Christmas time, because all that chaos, it's like sensory overload.
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
And you will see her just stop and walk, right, and just walk
Yeah.
where I go. And when we first met, she was a lot better now. When we first met, she was nobody. We'd run into somebody I knew in Walmart. She would stand behind me and let me start the conversation. And she might, and then I'd introduce her like, oh, but she might, and she'd just stand there kind of like,
Yeah.
hi. And now
So-
she'll speak to them, but it's just,
So it sounds like you're already learning to identify some of those things that will trigger it. So the two approaches that I would take if it were me personally, I would, number one, I would try to get you to identify any kind of triggers that would cause or put her into a situation where she's uncomfortable. But you also would, remember I said the brain's like a soup. So you may have a component in your soup that is too much or too little. And it may actually be beneficial to try to take a synthetic type to balance out your soup. Okay. The other side of that is, this is the tricky part. So let's say you're adding more carrots into your soup. Well, it may be that as you age and progress, your brain changes to the point where now there's less liquid in your soup, there's less corn and green beans and other things. And so while the carrots worked good for a while, now we need to reevaluate and see, do we need more of that, less of that, or do we need something even different? Do not be afraid of that. It's basically what normally happens is, they'll put you on something and they'll watch you, observe you really carefully for about 2 weeks and see, okay, is this going to work? But don't be surprised if things change over time. Hopefully they're getting better. But if you find that they're getting worse, first thing you got to do is be honest and tell your spouse and say, look, I'm having more bad days than good days, so that they can get your soup ironed out. Good question. Back to social connections. It is really, really, God created us to be with other people. And so understand, Christian fellowship is a big deal. I think during COVID we saw that. We realized, hey, you know what? We weren't meant to just stay in our homes and not have any kind of interactions. Same thing with brain health. That's a very, very, very big issue about it. What are some of the risks? We've talked about some already. Accidents, obviously. So you can do trauma to your brain. You can have all kinds of things from falls to basically anything. Traffic accidents, alcohol, believe it or not necessarily one of those things that you want to be doing because you are impairing the very thing that you're trying to make healthy. Other risk factors, smoking, or how about this one? Medicines. This is the big old fat pink elephant sometimes that we don't talk about in medicine. If you don't have a good medical team, get one. And here's what I mean by that. Sometimes you've got a rheumatologist and a cardiologist and an internist and a whatever else you got. And they work good with you about their problem, but maybe they're not communicating with these other people. And so this guy over here, he's prescribing something that's great for your cardiovascular system, but it's horrible for your arthritis. And so what you got to do is you've got to have a team where all of them know what's actually going on. I'm going to give you a personal example. When my mom came in to move with us, first thing I did, I looked, she was on loads of pills. I was like, good gracious, this is like, I'm a pharmacy. Found out she was on 3 antidepressants. 3 had been described by 3 different doctors. Because she had complained to 3 different doctors about a similar symptom, all 3 prescribed a different type of antidepressant. Well, it was basically making her a zombie. And she didn't realize that and did not have the cognitive awareness to go, I probably shouldn't be doing this. We immediately took her off of a couple of them, and all of a sudden, major improvements. So make sure that you've got a medical team that's actually talking to each other. Other health conditions can obviously affect brain health. We talked a little bit about diabetes, about sleep, about those kinds of things. Even high blood pressure. I was talking to somebody about the hardening of the arteries used to be, basically that used to be all they would prescribe or diagnose people with. Oh, they're old, they got hardening of their arteries. Well, now they realize that's just kind of a symptom of other things that are going on. And so, real quickly, if you want to reduce your risk, obviously manage cholesterol. You don't want to have too much floating around. Control your blood pressure, because high blood pressure is going to affect your brain. If you've got, it's just like a car tire. If you overinflate a car tire, it's going to wear out a lot quicker and it may wear unevenly. Same thing with your vessels in your brain. You want them to not be too swollen or too constricted. You want them properly inflated, so to speak. Eat healthily, quit smoking, limit alcohol, and limit exposure to air pollution. Same thing with things like diabetes. Realize it damages blood vessels throughout the body, including the brain. So if you are diabetic, make sure that you are controlling that you are taking the right medications. And also we talked a little bit about sleep. I'm already way over, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to open it up for your comments and questions, and we'll go from there.
One of the things about blood pressure, and some times ago, blood pressure, what they considered high, like somebody with 140 was
Right.
normal.
Yeah.
Now it's got to be 120.
Yeah.
And then the conclusion is, well, you're not 120, so let's give you all these drugs.
Yeah.
And, what are these drugs going to do to me?
Right. So I always tell people, use some common sense. And I'll give you an example. My cholesterol, if I checked it right now, it'd probably be about 130-ish. My wife would be about 250. Now you hear that and it's like, whoa, she's got really high blood pressure. Here's the interesting side of that. My wife's family, genetically speaking, is predisposed to having a fatty liver. They have higher cholesterol. Her normal is like 220, 230. They would say that's high. Well, for her situation, that's actually her normal. And so we have to use our common sense and go, okay, if her normal range is 240 and her body works fine with 240, we don't need to be on a statin. Now, if it got to 280, 300, 360, then yeah, that's higher than her normal. But her normal is different from my normal. Even though we may be processing the same foods, doing the same amount of exercise, her normal is different. Same thing with blood pressure. So if you have been genetically predisposed by your parents to have higher blood pressure, please understand, it used to be 140 was kind of considered the high range, then they dropped it down and said, oh, well, we're going to go 120. Let's say my blood pressure is 128 over 89. I'm not going to let somebody immediately put me on a lifelong pills from one time being a few points over. What I want to see is, what does it look like when over a period of time and with me eating right and exercising right? Because you know what? Most people's blood pressure actually goes up when they go see a doctor. My mother-in-law, hers jumps 10 points every time. We'll take it at my kitchen table before we go, and then we'll take it at the doctor's office every time. It's 10 points higher. But we know that, and so we're able to account and factor that in. So, good point. If you realize, hey, it's staying at 135, I wouldn't necessarily put myself on a lifelong of statins that can cause a whole lot of other problems.
As far as the statins is what I brought this up. I was on a torvastatin before that, and I just felt, I'd wake up every morning and I just ached like somebody beat me with broom.
Yes, yeah.
So I talked to my doctor, and she's like, well, that does sometimes cause that.
Yep.
So she took me off of that. Well, she actually told me to stop taking it for 2 weeks, see if I felt better. Then start taking it again and see if I started hurting again, which I did. So she took me off of that and put me on rosuvastatin. And that at first was great, but I'm still getting this somewhat. So I don't know if that's the only thing wrong with it now. But still.
Let me throw this out, just, and I hope you guys will think about it, pray about it, chew on it at home. Our rule of thumb is, if God made it, it's good. If man made it, it's questionable.
Yes.
And so there are lots of good things out there that you can introduce into your body to help naturally lower some of these things or help you in certain ways. Always try those first, especially if we're talking about small differences. If we're talking about high blood pressure, cholesterol, and it's just a little bit over what they deem as normal, go with something more holistic, natural first, rather than just dumping synthetic chemicals into your body and hoping that that's going to fix it. Because sometimes dumping the synthetics in is actually going to cause more problems in the long term.
I'm curious, have you thought of the physical connections with the spiritual connections? And if you have, could you give us some thoughts?
Yeah, so several years ago I wrote a book called The Truth About Human Origins. It's a 500-600 page hardback. If you ever have trouble sleeping, it's a good book. Okay. In the middle of that book, we did a couple of chapters on consciousness. And very quickly found ourselves so deep that even we were like, holy cow, this is really incredible to think about. What does it mean to be self-aware and to be conscious? And there have actually been, believe it or not, there are experiments that show your consciousness is different from your physical brain matter. Which means we actually have experiments that show there's two different things going on there. Science doesn't want to admit that, but you are more than just a brain firing neurons. I'll send you some stuff to read. It's pretty deep.
Similar with dreams and things. When you sleep, your brain
Oh yeah.
analyze things that you did in the day, but it's not really your brain firing. You're just your neurons are just kind of going through what happened.
And it's almost like you're allowing them so much room to rest that it's like they're just kind of in a playground doing whatever they want, just
Yeah.
going crazy. Yes, sir.
Which goes somewhat back, doesn't it, to that God built into us a moral consciousness. You know, it's like
Absolutely.
I was really fascinated when folks here when you put the frog in there and you talk about pushing
And
the
they're
button.
like,
oh no!
I watched that on purpose. So yeah, we have a moral code, which, by the way, more proof that there's a God. Because when I mention words like rape or sodomy or murder somebody, or we immediately think of that as wrong. Okay, well, what makes that wrong? There has to be a standard that makes it wrong. We know that there's a God and we've adopted his unchanging standard. Evolutionists would say, no, we got our standard for man. We evolved our standard. Okay, the problem with that is what man gets to decide. Because Hitler thought he was doing good. He thought he was creating the perfect race. But he was killing millions of people to do it. His standard, totally different. So yeah, the fact that we have a moral code, by the way, there have been research done, islands that are totally independent from each other, the natives on those islands actually held a very similar moral code to each other, even though they've never communicated to each other. Most of them did not have a Bible. They were still holding to a moral code that we would ascribe came from originally from God. So, good point. One or two more, and then I'm way past my time. Yeah.
You guys hear that the pharmaceutical companies are not in it for the cure, but they're in it for customers.
They're in it for
Customers.
Yeah, and if you actually fix something, they don't have a customer anymore. Let me see if I'm going to show you this just because it may take me just a second. Bear with me. A couple of screens. These are all coming from some type of plant that God created. So for instance, some of you are on things like a digoxin type cardiac deal. Comes from Digitalis Lanta. Go to the next page. I mean, literally all of this stuff that we're looking at is coming from plants. And there's lots of it. So that's why I say if there's a way to try a more natural way first, whatever God made is good.
Is there a link to that?
I tell you what I'll do. I'll give that to Mr. Rick, and that way he can pass that out, or print it out, or email it out, or whatever. One more, and then I'll let you guys go. Yes, sir.
Yeah, me too.
When God called Abraham out of the Ur of Chaldees, he chose him for a specific reason. That he was better than his peers, and he had a moral code at that time, but so did the rest of the people. And so, can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So he's talking about when Abraham was called out of the Ur of Chaldees, how he had a better moral code than the other people of his time. He was the one that was chosen. And I would even actually take it one step further and point to Noah, who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. But the text says the thoughts of men were on evil. What's the next word? Continually. So what you had happen was sin got introduced. All of a sudden it grew, which, by the way, we're watching in real time right now the basic expansion of what happens when, hey, you let sin go. In fact, let's just real quickly, let's see. second. Yeah, let's look at this one. So, used to be we would get prizes in the bottom of cereal. Now we have cereal that's promoting transgenderism. We have cartoons that are having gay parades. You got a drag queen serenading non-binary pansexual animals. You've got games, you got toys, all of these things that are promoting what the Bible calls abominations. And we're seeing it expand in real time. Now, it's not new. I mean, Paul wrote about it in 2 Timothy. He wrote about it in Romans chapter 1. God gave them over to a debased mind. But back to your thing, understand everybody has free will. I think the problem that was going on with Noah and with Abraham and today is we stopped calling sin what it really is. Folks, sin is sin. It's not a lifestyle. It's actually sodomy. And it's something that God burned down several cities for. When it comes to transgenderism, allowing children to say, well, today I identify as whatever, and use a different bathroom, that's not being diverse and inclusive. That's actually sickness, mental sickness. One of the things that I'm going to show you one more quick thing. That's the problem when you do what I do. You've got like 8 million slides. So 4,000% increase in children identifying as transgender in 2018. 4,000%. Here's the one, though, that I wanted you to see. 2007, there was one single clinic in the United States that would do sexual reassignment surgeries to prepubescent children under 16. Today there's 50.
It's ridiculous.
Now let me just point out, if you're doing radical mastectomies to 14-year-old girls, that's child abuse. And it's likely going to result in the end of that child's life with suicide. Because what's going to happen is they're going to hit 19, 20, 21. They're going to realize, you know what? These synthetic hormones I'm taking and the surgeries I had aren't really curing the loss and the void in my life. And now I'm scarred and I'm permanently mutated, which makes it even worse. You want to know what can fill the void in their life? There's only one thing, and that's Jesus Christ.